think they fixed your name.
Yes, they did. It's very nice. It honestly doesn't really much. And then, of course, Canadians often get people's names wrong all the time, when, you know, reversed order and all that stuff. Yeah. We're talking about you. Do you hear your ears burning? Only ears. I don't think you.
Hello and welcome everybody. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Welcome to this panel discussion on rethinking WTO dispute settlements. J'aimerais commencer par reconnaître que l'Université d'Ottawa est située en territoire non cédé du peuple algonquin. We welcome you warmly to the University of Ottawa, which is situated on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. My name is Wolfgang Alschner. I hold the Hyman Soloway Chair in Business and Trade Law here at the University of Ottawa. And as you've just heard, we are recording this event. And I think there is a, yeah, okay, perfect. So this panel is part of a larger conference that we're organizing over 3 days. It is co-organized with my colleagues, Professor Hélène Ruiz Fabri of the Max Planck Institute Luxembourg for Procedural Law and Professor Gabrielle Marceau of the University of Geneva and also the WTO. I'm also delighted to say that Professor Gabrielle Marceau will join us at the University of Ottawa as a visiting professor in 2024. We are very much looking forward to this. We as organizers are also very grateful for the generous support that have made this event possible. We would not be here but for the significant financial contribution by the Max Planck Institute in Luxembourg for Procedural Law, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and the University of Ottawa and the Hyman Soloway Chair. We would also like to thank our sponsors and local partners. The Ottawa-based law firm Bennett Jones will generously support part of the gathering that we'll hold as part of a closed-door event that will follow this public conference. We are also grateful to our local partners, the Canadian Council on International Law, the Center for International Policy Studies, and Professor Patrick Leblanc's CN Tellier Chair on Business and Public Policy. Some of you may have attended a joint event between my Hyman Soloway Chair and Patrick Leblanc's Tellier Chair just a few weeks ago on friendshoring, and we plan to continue hosting events here at the University of Ottawa that not only rethink WTO dispute settlement, but international economic governance more generally. Last but not least, I would like to thank everyone who's been involved in the organization of this event and the technical and logistical support. I would like to single out in particular my assistant, Lisa Iremescu, who has shouldered most of the preparatory work here for this panel. Now, on to substance. As many of you know, WTO dispute settlement is in a bit of a crisis mode these days. The Appellate Body, the WTO's highest adjudicatory body, has been defunct since 2019. And that has also affected the first stage of WTO dispute settlement, the panel stage, where panel reports can be appealed into the void, leaving WTO obligations unenforceable. There's now hope on the horizon. In June 2022, the members of the WTO have agreed to work together towards reestablishing and I quote, fully and well-functioning dispute settlement system that is accessible to all members by a very ambitious deadline in 2024. So the race is on to rethink WTO dispute settlement, and this is why we are here today. And that brings us to our panel. I will very briefly introduce each of our highly distinguished panelists. Their bios are, as you can undoubtedly imagine, extremely long, so we've put them on our event website. I will just highlight a few of their major accomplishments and showcase why they're here today. I will start to my left. I'll introduce our moderator, Professor Kristen Boone, in just a second, but I'll start with the panelists. So here is first Henry Gao. Henry Gao is an associate professor of law at Singapore Management University. Professor Gao was the first Chinese lawyer to serve at the WTO Secretariat and is today regarded as one of the world's foremost experts on China and the WTO. Together with Wei Sun, he has recently published a book with Cambridge University on state capitalism and the WTO. Next, we turn to Meredith Lilly. Meredith Lilly holds the Simon Reisman Chair in International Economic Policy at Carleton University, which is a university here in Ottawa, just a couple of minutes from here. Professor Lilly has served as trade policy advisor to the Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper for many years. And now in academia, Professor Lilly is one of the leading thinkers on the role of Canada in North America and in world trade. Turning now to Mona Paulsen. Mona Paulsen is an assistant professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Paulsen is also a fellow Canadian and one of the leading commentators on international economic governance. Whenever I open my Twitter account, the first thing I do is to check what Mona has said about recent events so that I'm up to speed. And I've heard that even the WTO Director General is a fan of Mona's work. So we are very lucky to have her here, and she'll speak to us on how to make sense of national security concerns in international trade law. I turn next to Robert Howes. Rob Howes is the Lloyd C. Nelson Professor of International Law at NYU School of Law. Professor Howes is also a fellow Canadian, and if I can say that, one of the most creative and prolific scholars in international law that I know. Very impressive work, and WTO law is just one of his many areas of expertise. We are very delighted to have him here. He'll be talking about a recent article that he co-authored in the American Journal of International Law together with Joanna Langle, who is to his left. Joanna Langle is an assistant professor at the University of Western Ontario, Faculty of Law. Professor Langle currently serves also as the vice chair of the International Economic Interest Group of the American Society of International Law. Her research also covers a wide range of subjects, but similar to Professor Howes, she'll be talking about her recent article on the evolution of the WTO. And last, but definitely not least, we have Ricardo Ramirez. Ricardo Ramirez is a professor at the Faculty of Law of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Professor Ramirez brings a very unique perspective to this panel. He is both a former trade official and trade negotiator and served at the WTO Appellate Body between 2009 and 2017. So we are very lucky to have him here. And as you can see, you can scarcely imagine a more qualified and highly distinguished panel than we have here to walk us through the current state and future of rethinking WTO dispute settlement. So let me also introduce the moderator for this session, who one can also scarcely imagine to be a better person to moderate this panel. Kristen Boone is the Susan and Perry Dillis Dean of the Faculty of Law, Common Law section of the University of Ottawa. Professor Boone is an eminent international lawyer with a wide interest across public international law subject areas, but including WTO and in general dispute settlements. I'll give the floor to Dean Boone in just a second. Just last minute housekeeping points. So we have a nice large audience in the room who will be treated to a reception afterwards. The audience online is even larger. Please don't hesitate to write questions and comments in the chat. We'll monitor this and there'll be an opportunity at the end to ask questions. Of course, in the room, you are also invited to ask questions. And that is it. As I said, this event is being recorded, so be mindful what you're saying. Okay, with that, I'll pass the floor to Dean Boone.
Great. Thank you very much, Wolfgang. Welcome everybody to the University of Ottawa. It is fantastic to see this full house and to know that there are 600 people online as well too. Thank you to the other organizers, to Gabrielle, to Hélène, and to our panelists for joining us here today. We are leaders in international law here at the University of Ottawa, and I am really thrilled to see this important conversation taking place today. I think we are going to have a fantastic exchange on a cutting edge topic, and I look forward to learning from the panelists and to thinking about how we take the knowledge and the learnings back out into the community after. So let me start with a question for Rob. Rob, you have published a recent article with Joanna Langill in the American Journal of International Law. Can you tell us what is the problem with the appellate body? Why is it under fire right now? Yes, please. Thank you.
D'abord, je dois dire que c'est un vrai honneur de participer au lancement de cette importante colloque co-organisée par le professeur Alschner, également que des deux amis de longue date, les professeurs Marceau et Ruiz Fabri. Je vais faire mon intervention en anglais, mais je vous invite de poser des questions dans les deux langues et continuer le débat soit en anglais, soit en français. There is an ominous rhythm of crisis in the world today. A crisis of confidence in others, a crisis of faith in ourselves. I begin with these words, which are from the first speech I worked on for Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau when I was a young diplomat and policy advisor in Ottawa 40 years ago, because both those words and in some sense, rereading the whole speech in a Proustian moment might also apply in many ways to the tensions that exist today, including between China and the United States. And Trudeau's intent with that speech and the interventions that followed the so-called peace initiative was to try and reduce tensions and improve communications. At the time, it was between the Soviet bloc and the West, but particularly the United States of Ronald Reagan. And whether there's a role for that for Canada today in the present environment, I leave as a question on the table. So what's the problem with the appellate body? It doesn't exist anymore. And it doesn't exist, as we know, because beginning in the Trump administration, the position of the United States was that it would systematically block any effort to appoint new members of the appellate body as the older ones retired. And I think my co-author, Joe Langill, will get a bit into some of the background to that decision. So, but it seems to me the important question is what purpose or function did the appellate body serve, and what have we lost, and what might we need to regain in order to have a fully functional WTO. And this is a question way beyond even the issue of dispute settlement, important as it is in the focus of this conference that Joe and I elaborate in our article. Well, there are really two functions. One is to provide greater legitimacy and quality control for the settlement of individual disputes between WTO members in a way that is both satisfactory for them and legitimate for the system as a whole. The other function, the one that we focus more on in our article and in also our earlier scholarship, for example, on the sealed products case that some of you will be familiar with, is a kind of more of a delicate legitimacy function of determining starting from general rules like non-discrimination and general exceptions such as those in Article 20 of the GATT, an equilibrium between policing the rules against protectionist cheating and providing legal security for policy space for legitimate regulation. And so the situation we have today, I think, is not so terrible with regard to the settlement of individual disputes, that function. And you can see that many members are bringing cases to panels despite the non-existence and questionable future of the appellate instance in the WTO. There have been some ad hoc innovations, such as creating appellate instances in individual cases through the MPIA or through ad hoc compromis. The question is really the second function and how long the WTO can survive the current political environment if there is not an active, in a way, constitutional court for the system. And I think we posed this question in the paper, in the article. My own judgment is it can survive for a period of time because the appellate body jurisprudence in general, and we have criticisms, but in general was so good in kind of defining that equilibrium. That's not to say the technical analysis or reasoning is necessarily that good, but in some sense, it preserved what we call the pluralism of the system. And the fact that so many of the members missed the appellate body when it was disappearing suggests a very strong legitimacy function, a systemic legitimacy function. And how to get that back? That's really the question. And the one observation would be, can we move from ad hoc solutions like the MPIA to an appellate body which doesn't necessarily have compulsory jurisdiction and appeal as a right? Now that may not help so much in solving individual disputes. There we might need to just improve the quality and professionalism of the first instance, as my colleague Petros Vervoides, who's here in the back, has argued. In terms of the systemic function, well, look at the International Court of Justice. We know that not only does the United States now not accept its compulsory jurisdiction at all, many other countries don't either, or subject to reservations. So has this stopped the World Court from performing this systemic jurisprudential function? I don't think it stopped it from doing that. And you can see that in the citation of ICJ precedent in numerous regimes, from the WTO regime itself to the investment regime to the law of the sea and so forth. So if we can't get back an appellate body with compulsory jurisdiction, can we have an appellate court that has this systemic legitimacy function even without the acceptance of compulsory jurisdiction of all WTO members? I think it's certainly possible, and I think the ICJ is an example of it. But I just throw that out there as one question we might want to discuss and debate going forward today.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for also highlighting the ripple effects across different regimes, which is a very important comment. Joanna, the WTO's appellate body is maybe part of the reason for the current crisis, or at least according to what you and Rob have called the Washington critique in your paper. The United States has accused the appellate body of judicial activism and overreach. Interestingly, you talk about the appellate body, however, as not the villain, but the hero of the story. So to set the stage, can you speak about the tension between the appellate body and the WTO?
Yeah, absolutely. So Kristen, thank you so much for this question, and thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. It's really an honor to be here because I'm a bit of an outlier, an outsider. I write about trade and a whole number of other different topics. So this is really, truly very special to me. So thank you so much for having me and giving me this chance to speak to you all. So thank you. I'll take the opportunity now to respond to this question. So I want to say two things. First, I want to talk a little bit about why the Americans have caused this crisis in the appellate body. And in particular, I want to talk about their critique that the WTO's appellate body has overreached and engaged in judicial activism, as Kristen put it, and as they have put it as well. And then secondly, I want to offer perhaps a different way of characterizing the appellate body's jurisprudential acquis that Rob and I have written about, that perhaps challenges whether the American characterization of the appellate body's work is in fact accurate. So let's now talk about what the American beef is all about. So Rob has said that the current crisis at the WTO is basically as follows. So the United States, beginning a little bit in the Obama administration, but then systematically with the Trump administration, stopped appointing appellate body members to the WTO. And by 2019, that meant that we had no more appellate body anymore. And that meant we no longer had two-instance dispute settlement anymore at the WTO. And it also meant, as Wolfgang mentioned in his introduction, that the panel or kind of trial level has also kind of been, its effectiveness has also been compromised, because if a member doesn't want to kind of uphold and enforce the panel judgment against them, they can simply appeal that panel judgment, what's called into the void. And that means that because the rules say that panel judgments aren't enforceable when they're under appeal, well, the panel judgment disappears or the panel report disappears as well. So this is a very significant crisis that the Americans have caused by kind of stopping the appellate body in its tracks by systematically getting rid of all the people. So my first question today, why have they done this? That's, I think, very important for all of us to understand. And so the US has given a whole number of different reasons, some procedural and very technical, some more kind of schematic. And I think those schematic kind of and almost philosophical point of view, aspects of their point of view, are what Kristen has asked me to talk about today. So what has the US argued? Well, they've claimed that the appellate body has engaged in what they've called judicial activism and overreach, and that the AB has gone beyond the text of the WTO's covered agreements to fill in what they've called gaps in treaty texts and change the rights of WTO members. For example, they've pointed to the AB's jurisprudence on anti-dumping and countervailing measures and subsidies, and argued that the AB has limited members' ability to take unilateral trade remedies in response to state-led economies such as China. So, basic claim, the AB isn't following the letter of the law, and in so doing, they've prevented countries like the US from disciplining non-market economies. Of course, there are a range of other complaints as well, but that's kind of the character of this judicial overreach or judicial activism claim. So, is this correct? The second issue I want to talk to you about today. Or is there a different way of characterizing what the appellate body has done with its substantial jurisprudence of 148 reports before it was so systematically disbanded? So in our writing, Rob and I have offered a different account, shall we say, of the appellate body's jurisprudence. And in so doing, I think, and this is kind of the theorist in me, we've also adopted a rather different account of legality than the one implicit in the American critique of the WTO. We've argued that, as Rob kind of alluded to, the AB's jurisprudence is best characterized as having developed a coherent, sophisticated and comprehensive interpretation of the various WTO covered agreements. We've called this a pluralist approach because we say it's kind of acted to preserve the ability of states to regulate for reasons they consider to be important and to organize their domestic political and economic structures as they see fit, while of course also ensuring that the WTO's agreements continue to address the potential economic harms that come from certain types of trade measures. So in essence, we think the AB has sought to develop an account of WTO law that's largely neutral between different types of domestic legal orders. And we think this approach is rooted, of course, in the text of the WTO's covered agreements, but we think it also has taken into account their kind of object and purpose and has generally sought to offer a systematic and comprehensive approach that reads the agreements together. And we think in focusing exclusively on trade remedy cases, the US has really distorted this record. And instead, we think the AB has generally interpreted WTO norms rather deferentially, giving substantial scope to individual states to regulate as they see fit, protecting their right to make governance choices. We pointed to the appellate body's jurisprudence on Article 20, the general exceptions provisions, as well as numerous other areas, including the SBS and TBT agreements. So in arguing for this pluralist reading, we've implicitly denied the charge of judicial activism. Instead, we've argued that offering this kind of comprehensive theory of how all of this law is supposed to fit together and developing this pluralist framework is intrinsic to the nature of what WTO adjudication is all about. In fact, that is doing the job of WTO adjudication, both because offering this kind of coherent, comprehensive approach is, we think, what judges are meant to do, and because independence and impartiality dictates that this pluralism protecting interpretive approach is also a kind of necessary part of their role. So we can agree with the US that maybe on certain trade remedies cases, as I think Rob is suggesting, we would, of course, we can quibble with these particular rulings. That's absolutely fine. But we would also kind of agree, maybe some more unilateral rebalancing is necessary under a pluralist theory. But that's not because the appellate body was judicially activist in any of those cases. They just might have gotten it wrong, as all adjudicators will do from time to time. That doesn't mean we would conclude that this is a judicially activist court in any way. And we would certainly disagree with the US critique of of their inability to discipline non-market economies as the basis of using these trade remedies, as we think that's also inconsistent with pluralism. So just to sum up, I'm sorry, Kristen, I'll stop, but this is all so exciting. I just want to talk about this forever. Rob and I have argued really for a very different approach to law and legality than the one that underlies the US critique. So law for us isn't a positivistic series of pre-agreed rules that have gaps that lawmakers can fill or not fill. That is not our theory of what law actually is. Instead, law is best understood as a coherent normative undertaking that can be interpreted in various different ways when judges take principles and apply them to particulars when making this normative ordering coherent. So the kind of positivistic, highly positivistic, even as a contract lawyer, I think incorrect theory of law that underlies the US claim we think is wrong. We also disagree, of course, with their account of the international adjudicator, because we think their role is to give effect to that coherent normative ordering through systematic interpretation that doesn't privilege any particular type of domestic system. As such, we think the appellate body's development of a coherent, pluralist vision for the WTO is an extraordinary achievement that was consistent with that judicial role, not in tension with it. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Henry, maybe I can turn to you now. The economic and geopolitical rivalry between China and the United States is at least partly behind the current dissatisfaction by decision makers in Washington with the performance of the WTO. Can you please explain why China's role in the WTO is so special and how the relationship has soured?
Sure, thank you. I want to start by thanking Wolfgang and Hélène and Gabrielle for kindly inviting me to the conference. It's really nice to see so many old friends. So as you rightly pointed out, China is very special in world trade, and I would describe this in both the quantitative and qualitative terms. In the quantitative term, if you look back, when China acceded to the WTO in 2001, China was only the 6th largest trader in the world. But by 2009, China has become the world's top exporter of goods. And currently, China is the top trading partner to more than 120 countries. And that is more than any other country in the world, including the US. At the qualitative level, China's economic rise is very different from those of not only Western countries, but even of its Asian neighbors, such as Japan and Taiwan, because its system is heavily reliant on state-owned enterprises, industrial subsidy, and all kinds of government industrial policy. And this is some people would call it state capitalist model. So this is a present problem for the US, because from the US perspective, the Chinese market is not as open as the US, and there are all kinds of market access barriers. And even if you can get into the Chinese market, there are also many invisible barriers which would make it hard for foreign firms to operate. So this has resulted in massive deficit in the US-China bilateral trade, which numbers around $400 billion US every year. So to put it in the colorful terms that President Trump once used, China has eaten the US lunch, so that is a big challenge for the US. But more broadly, in recent years, China has been trying to export its development model to other countries in the global south by, for example, promoting its Belt and Road Initiative and providing all kinds of loans to all these developing countries. And that also challenged the US-based Washington consensus. So to bring this back to the main theme of our panel today, the US actually tried to challenge these barriers through the WTO dispute settlement system, but the US did not get all the results it wanted. And this is also reflected in the US criticism against the Appellate Body, with many of the complaints actually related to the China issues. For example, if you look at the 2020 report on the Appellate Body by the USTR, the US actually listed 6 substantive interpretive errors, so-called interpretive errors by the Appellate Body. And at least 3 of these are directed against the Appellate Body's decisions in cases involving China. These include, for example, the public body jurisprudence developed in the US anti-dumping and countervailing duties case concerning China, the requirement to consider government prices before using out-of-country benchmarks in the US countervailing measures China 21-5 case, and also the ban on double remedies through the concurrent application of countervailing duties and anti-dumping duties in the US anti-dumping and countervailing duties China case. So I actually agree with Rob and Joanna's argument that the Appellate Body has been doing a good job actually in these cases by trying to accommodate probably these approaches of different WTO members, but the US apparently has a different review. For them, this is actually one of the mistakes made by the Appellate Body. So to sum up, you could see that one of the main reasons for the current crisis of the WTO dispute settlement system is the alleged failure by the Appellate Body to address the China challenge.
Great, thank you very much. Mona, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about national security interests and how, in particular, the WTO agreements have dedicated security exceptions in the trade context.
So let me also begin by thanking Wolfgang, Hélène, and Gabrielle for the opportunity to have me here, and particularly to Wolfgang for his generous comments to introduce me. Thank you. Okay, so I'm here to talk about how security is changing WTO dispute settlement, which sort of differs a little bit from my previous colleagues in the sense that the Appellate Body has not opined on this issue. So let me start by first saying that I think the idea that trade policy must have a security dimension isn't new, right? An economist may not care where something is made, but certainly we will, as we see today, a national security advisor will care about where production takes place and who controls that process.
And we saw one of the cases recently, DS 597, on that very topic. And we saw trade multilateralism begin, and I have to reflect on this history to help kind of explain where I'm going with this relationship and why it's in tension. So trade multilateralism really quickly became a part of the US arsenal in managing communism. And what we begin to see there is the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade, was a tool. It was an effort to create this industrialized, American-led community. So it was an important part of why the US believed that trade institutions were necessary. And at the same time, what we're dealing with today is states taking action against one another within that community, which at the time was not imagined. So when the US created this institution, it didn't necessarily imagine that that would happen. You know, it was negotiating a trade treaty with China, but this was before the Chinese Communist Revolution. And the Soviets did not take part in the negotiation of the GATT or the International Trade Organization, which was supposed to work with this preliminary tariff agreement. So we don't have that kind of awareness that we have today about what it means to have governments bring these kind of disputes. Trade institutions were supposed to bind states, but increasingly the United States quickly learned that that meant that it was bound as well. And what we began to see with this relationship between trade and security was that it was sort of a have your cake and eat it too kind of situation, where you want to have a lot of trade policy flexibility. You want to be able to have that ability to deal with different rules, but you also want to ensure that other governments are not, you know, drawing on tenuous links to security and potentially abuse. So you want to have lots of ambiguity, but then you don't want to have it be subject to abuse. So what is new about where we are with trade security today? Well, for one thing, the really clear one is that governments are much more willing to take trade action openly to protect essential security interests. So that's something that we have seen before, but I think what is very fresh is that we are seeing governments be quite willing to bring disputes to the WTO about those security measures. And this is where we're at in the past under 10 years, where we've seen a series of cases now come out, particularly, I think, the most remarkable being challenges against US policies. And so I think in thinking about this, why that becomes really remarkable is that security was always seen as the exception, not just because an exception to the rules, but an exception to really thinking more fundamentally about what the WTO and the GATT legal order is meant to do, to be an open, transparent, non-discriminatory forum. Here we begin to see how security works. We see that it's closed, it's non-transparent. There's no obligation to provide feedback. There's no obligation to try to work in compliance. It really operates in the other, which can be potentially complicated for a system that doesn't work that way. So the other thing I think to think about in thinking about how trade security is changing dispute settlement is this question of justiciability, which is one that the United States began to introduce quite quickly on, this argument that when a government defends its measures on the basis of national security or essential security interests, it does so in the belief that no panel may review that invocation. And that, of course, that only the government that's invoking it has the authority to determine whether or not, you know, the panel has simply no purview or no jurisdiction to review that invocation. Now, every single WTO panel that has assessed a government's invocation of essential security has said that that is not true, that actually the invocation, there are aspects of that invocation that are subject to assessment. But the justiciability of GATT Article 21 and its comparables and other WTO covered agreements is not really just about that ability to allow a panel to determine whether the invocation was justified or not. It really also triggers this whole other aspect about what to do after, what comes next. The system really works on this way of calibration, that if the government is inconsistent, there is a way for the governments, the WTO members, to return to that equilibrium, to return to all agreeing to enforce compulsory dispute settlement. There's a tension there when it comes to security, because oftentimes if a government asserts that the invocation is self-judging and non-justiciable, then you never really get to that next part of what it means. And governments may not be willing in the same way they would calibrate their other measures to do so when it comes to something that is involved with essential security. And so I think what we have to think about here is how, when we're thinking about this issue of why the United States agreed to have this exception within the rules and what it thought that it was doing within this American-led community that it was trying to build. One of the interesting things is that the United States wanted to have this institution, and at the same time, they were very aware of a delicate balance. They knew that they had to try to enable other governments to trust in the system, but they were very careful about it not becoming the exception that swallows the rule. So you inevitably want to try to see in the negotiations then discussions about invoking only for so-called real security interests, not for potential abuse or domestic protection. You want to find a balance where also internally within the United States, there is agreement. The defense departments are aware and they're content with the framing of this exception within the broader trade rules. The United States was also very concerned about governments at the time invoking it for regional preferences, imperial preferences, and for import substitution, industrialization, ISI-led strategies. Inevitably driven by diplomacy, that system was supposed to work under US leadership. And of course, the negotiation of this exception that has become problematic today was not the end of the story. The United States imagined that in subsequent discussions, through the creation of the International Trade Organization, through some of the coherent system that was supposed to be created, they were going to fine-tune that negotiation. And of course, it didn't turn out that way. I'll go back to that history in a second, but let me very quickly talk about where we're at with these dispute settlement cases. So essentially, there are three baskets where the GATT security exceptions can apply. Now, WTO panels have only evaluated one of those baskets, and that has to do with acting in time of war or other emergency in international relations. That basket doesn't anticipate military potential or planning. And I'll explain a little bit more of that later on in our discussion. The panels uniformly, though, have a common message. One, GATT Article 21, the invocation of GATT Article 21 is not entirely self-judging. It does not lie in the power of the government that invokes it. And the other is that when it comes to this basket, this circumstance of acting in time of war or other emergency in international relations, that war seems to be very clearly drawn to traditional military definitions of security and acts of war. But emergency in international relations is something that has to be as close as possible to war. And so therefore, the panels have all narrowed that scope to really only cover breakdown, severe breakdown, or near breakdown of international relations. And so to that extent, they have attempted to significantly narrow the part of the security exceptions that they also have found to be subject to objective assessment. The question then, I think, comes down to what to think about the US invocation of this. So the US has invoked it in one way that we've all become familiar with through the Trump administration, the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum. I think a lot of people dwell on the tariffs themselves as subject to these security exceptions. But importantly, and this is with a paper that I'm writing with Petros Mavroidis and Kamal Sagi, it's not just about the tariffs that the United States asserted essential security. It's also the product exclusions and the country exemptions that were a part of that package that were significant then when they went before the panel and argued that it was for both domestic production capacity reasons and the broader global excess capacity for steel and aluminum. The other really important part of thinking about those 232 tariffs is that the United States understood that not as acting in a current war. So this comes back to Henry's point of the relationship between the United States and China. They didn't believe that at the time when those actions were being taken, that they were responding to a relationship with China that had already fractured. They were responding to the potential threat for the loss of what they viewed as a dire essential security concern, though it was related to China's growing rise in competitiveness in those factors. But of course, they responded in numerous ways to their allies, Canada, of course, being included in that originally before they negotiated the tariffs away. So we don't have guidance on how to handle some of those questions because the United States lost at the ability to show emergency international relations, and military potential being a basket that has not been adjudicated at all. And that is a really important part of the security exceptions that I'll come back to next. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that really interesting description and discussion about the vague and the nebulous concept of security exceptions and how they're starting to become more concrete through judicial action. So we have two more speakers left in this first round, Ricardo and Meredith. So Ricardo, let me pass the floor to you now. As multilateral dispute settlement is becoming more challenging, we are seeing more activities through plurilateral agreements between a subset of WTO members, such as the creation of a plurilateral interim appeal instance, the MPIA, and new regional trade agreements like CUSMA that set up their own dispute settlement mechanisms. Do we see countries walking away from multilateral trade dispute settlement, in your opinion?
Hello, thanks for the invitation, Gabrielle, Wolfgang, Hélène. Of course, I will refrain to make any comment on the Appellate Body for now. I remember that back in 1995, when I entered the government, we used to come to Ottawa like 3 or 4 times a year, you know, and maybe take lessons from John once in a while, and we stopped coming to Ottawa. So you make me remember that I need to come more often. So in order to answer the question, I try to see the three instances at hand starting from the same starting point, which is, I will use July 2020, which was when the CUSMA entered into force. And what has happened in the 3 instances since July 2020? And I'm going to talk first about CUSMA, then I'm going to talk about the MPIA, and then I'm going to talk about the WTO. And then I will be in a position to answer the question of whether we are moving from regional to multilateral, from multilateral to regional. CUSMA. As you know, CUSMA entered into force in July 2020. Of course, some of you not, but some of you are young to know about the NAFTA, but let me tell you about the NAFTA. The NAFTA dispute settlement provision was Chapter 20. And under the NAFTA, under the general mechanism, there were 3 panel reports. One regarding supply management, which is very known here. The other one regarding brooms, corners, brooms, and the other one regarding trucking between Mexico and the United States. There was a 4th dispute that was started, that was requested. There was a panel on sugar between Mexico and the US, which was never adjudicated because the US refused to name panelists for that case. And we call that the Achilles heel of the NAFTA Chapter 20 because you could not name panelists. So fast forward, USMCA, CUSMA, TEMEC, and they were trying to address this problem. And but let's not forget that the US starting position when the CUSMA negotiations started was no dispute settlement at all, or basically non-binding dispute settlement. And fortunately, Canada and Mexico convinced the US, I think more Canada than Mexico, convinced the US to keep this binding dispute settlement system. So how does the system has worked from July 2020? And I will say very well. You have 5 disputes requested. You have 4 panels, two disputes regarding Canada and US on a TRQ on dairy products. I think most of the room, most people in the room not much thinks about this than me. There was a safeguards imposed by the US on Canadian solar panels that was also adjudicated, and Canada won the case. And there was a dispute between Mexico and Canada against the US on a reading of rules of origin of the CUSMA. And of course, Canada and Mexico prevailed. We have another one, which is in consultation stage, one regarding, again, the TRQ on dairy products, and another one regarding measures taken by the Mexican government on the energy sector. So you have these panel reports. There was no problem in panelist selection. The process went very smoothly and swiftly. They complied with the deadlines, which was something new for everyone, even. And you could say there was the decisions were concise. There was not these long decisions by the Appellate Body. They were very, very concise. And they were substantially very solid, I will say. No, some of us may take issues to some interpretation of Article 32 of the Vienna Convention, but overall, those are very concise, very swift, very good decisions. So that's first one. The second one, the MPIA. You have the multi-party interim appeal arbitration agreement. Hope to get it right, Valerie. You have more than 50 members of the WTO there, including Canada, Mexico, the European Union, of course. You have 10 arbitrators, which basically represent the membership. And of course, this mechanism was thought about as interim, as is labeled, interim, while you have a new function in Appellate Body, which I don't think is going to happen soon, I guess. So that system, through that system, you have one dispute, one panel, one dispute adjudicated, one panel report. And if you are very generous, which is I am very generous, you can say it's two, because you have a dispute between the EU and Turkey, which also use most of the features of this system. You have in the pipeline, as I gather, one, but and in this decision, you could even talk about judicial activism, about the substance of the only decision that has been published by this panel, but I will not get into that. So one dispute, one panel report. And then you go to the WTO regular system. How many disputes have been filed since July 2020? It's been 21 disputes filed. You have only one panel report since then, and that is DS 597, which is the US origin marking case against Hong Kong, where the US lost the case and appeal, some say into the void, or froze the appeal because there's no appellate body. So those give me the elements to try to answer your question, which is, yes, members may be walking away from dispute settlement. But that does not mean or necessarily mean that regional trade agreements are the solution. I think the jury is still out. Don't open the champagne. There are still questions to be answered. And I'm gonna put, just to finish my presentation, two things that boggle me. The first one is implementation. And we are living in now in the CUSMA, because you have decisions. I understand that the dairy decision has been implemented. I'm not sure of that. The rules, safeguards decision between US and Canada, they signed a memo, I think, of trying to reach an agreement on this dispute. But on the rules of origin dispute, we have not heard from neither of the three governments. Neither Canada or Mexico are demanding compliance, much less requesting compensation, nor the United States has said anything about trying to comply with that ruling. So you could have very nice and very concise and very good decisions, but if you are not complying with them, well, you have a problem with the system. And I think the CUSMA system needs to be tested with with very complex and fact-intensive disputes. Because so far, though, all disputes have been about a measure, about an interpretation. We have not gone through a system, through a dispute that is really fact-intensive. We may have one, which is the US and Canada request against Mexico on corn, on GMO corn, which presumably will involve a lot of fact-intensive. So we still have to see whether this system with this secretariat in the CUSMA could adjudicate a very fact-intensive dispute. And the other one, which is highly political disputes. So far, these disputes, you have not seen a very highly political dispute go through the system. If the system can withstand this, maybe, just maybe, you can think of that as a reference for dispute settlement. But not until you see those things happen, at least for me. And I'm leaving aside this discussion about substance, because of course, there are some substantive provisions that you cannot adjudicate on regionals. But I will leave aside that. Just from the purely procedural process dispute settlement system, well, I think the jury is still out. So thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Meredith, I'd like to ask you about Canada now. On the one hand, Canada remains an ardent multilateralist and supports efforts to reinvigorate trade multilateralism. On the other hand, most of Canadian trade is with the United States. Could you tell us a little bit about this tension and the challenges facing Canada?
Sure, thank you, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. Yes, Canada is a big supporter of multilateralism, but I think that sometimes this commitment is overstated by the Canadians, if not others. You know, we're not multilateralists because Canadians are nice, but we like to think of ourselves that way. We're not multilateralists because we necessarily have a very deep belief in kind of the right of a plurality of social and economic systems. The truth is, if you look at our public opinion surveys, we mostly like to advance our trade relationships with other countries that look a lot like our own. And so the reality is that we're multilateralists because it serves Canada's interests to have a strong multilateral trade system. And we use that system as both a sword and a shield. We use it as a sword because we want to advance our national interests via multilateral engagement. We've done this in lots of forums, not just trade. The Law of the Sea is a good example. And we also use it as a shield because we want to bring the leverage and weight of the international system to help Canada defend our interests, primarily with the Americans. Because as you said, most of our bilateral trade is with the United States, a country that has an economy 10 times larger than our own. And as a result of most of our bilateral trade being with the Americans, most of our disputes are also with the Americans. And so at the WTO, our disputes with the United States equal the number that we have with the rest of the world combined. It really is, you know, quite essential to us that we have operating dispute settlement systems with the United States because we fight with them the most. And so our multilateral engagement is first and foremost to advance and protect our interests with the Americans. But then secondly, we do want to be involved actively in shaping international trade rules at the WTO. And we've successfully advanced our own interests largely by working with the Americans, because while we also argue with them a lot, we're also aligned with them on the majority of issues. And we have been very happy for the Americans to lead a lot of the difficult issues. I think that that's something that we have to acknowledge. And so now we've got this problem because US administrations from different political parties dating back to Obama, they believe that the dispute settlement system is broken, that it constrains the United States from using its bargaining power to retaliate as it wants. That same American unilateralism that Canadians worry about is the unilateralism that they want to use when and where they want to use it. And, so from my perspective, the Americans want an operating dispute settlement system, but as Mona said, they want their cake and they want to eat it too. They don't want to have to be bound to it themselves. And so when they shut down the AB and they're not complying with rules, this kind of primary driver for why Canada put so much effort into the WTO, largely, I don't want to say it disappears, but the value of that engagement is less for Canada. So we do still have USMCA, and we are able to use those dispute settlement processes. So there's lots of countries that don't have a free trade agreement with the United States, and their main mechanism is by going to the WTO. And USMCA isn't going to fix everything. You know, as Ricardo got into, the politics of the relationship, I think, become much more central when we decide if we're going to launch cases there. This is, I think, certainly part of what's happening with Mexico on energy. Sometimes we prefer being at the WTO for a variety of reasons. Not everything is covered by USMCA. It gives us a broader set of tools. And then there's also just the concern that the same set of problems that we're facing with the Americans at the WTO are just being transferred to USMCA. So we have real concerns that the rules of origin auto case just isn't going to be implemented. Like, we'll see if the Americans implement that decision. So, you know, coming back to the WTO, when I think about that secondary driver, you know, what kind of activities does Canada want to be engaged in? What are we prepared to undertake in the design of rules and processes if we can't count on the Americans to be there, either to do the hard work or us supporting them? And so lots of examples have already been mentioned. During the Trump administration, we worked to keep the lights on through the Ottawa group. We're part of the MPIA. These are, I think, very useful activities, but they always were intended to be temporary. The idea being the Americans would be back. And as time goes on, we're pretty concerned that maybe the Americans aren't going to be back, or not in a big way. And so as we think about that kind of future at the WTO, I think it's time for Canada to have pretty serious conversations amongst ourselves about what we're prepared to do around shaping those activities, as we constantly have to balance where that fits with the Americans. So.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, we're going to go into a second round here. I'd like to encourage the panelists to do rapid fire, because we've got so much expertise in the room and we want to ensure time for exchange. We've also got questions coming in online. So let's turn now to a quick discussion about scoping solutions and chartering a path for reform. Ricardo, could I come back to you? You have a background as both a former WTO Appellate Body member and a Mexican trade negotiator. What are your thoughts on how to reinvigorate multilateral trade dispute settlement?
Well, I'll be brief. I think the fate of dispute settlement is very much linked to the substantive rules and what happens at the WTO in general. Let's not forget that part of the demise of the Appellate Body was the lack of an agreement of the membership on interpreting the cover agreements that we got wrong, the interpretations that we got wrong. And let me blunt here, and maybe we need a shakeup here. WTO members and still think that negotiations can take any time, a lot of time, and that the best strategy is to reach something minimalist, ambiguous, and then declare victory, i.e. fisheries. To me, the fact that the membership, that the ministers accepted a ministerial declaration which provides for a fully functioning dispute settlement until 2024 is totally ridiculous. I'm being totally politically incorrect. 18 appeals into the void, 18, and without and counting every day. And you have 10 more disputes that were not adjudicated because the appellate body stopped functioning. So you have 28 disputes that have not been adjudicated. So let me go back to developing countries. For developing countries, the best strategy is to comply with the rules. Developing countries will not withstand power plays. Thus, how to invigorate the system? First, you have to abide by the rules. I don't know if some of the audience share what I think, that will agree with me, that we are the trade rules are becoming environment rules. Everyone like to have them, but nobody will comply with them. So at the end, trade rules are becoming environment rules. I am one of those who think that we can live without the appellate body, What we cannot live with is, and we will survive, especially from a developing country standpoint, is with a fully functioning, impartial, and independent dispute settlement system. And I will leave it at that.
Great. Thank you very much. Meredith, can I come back to you? What is the future for Canada with regards to the tension between multilateralism and the realpolitik, the current situation?
So I hope that I've already conveyed the idea that I think Canada engages on an interest-based kind of approach to multilateralism. And I think as I want to give you 3 examples, and I'll be super fast with respect to the request, but I think that our current behavior on these 3 examples shows that we're actually kind of prepared to do mix and match on this, depending on the circumstances. So, one example right now, hot topic, industrial subsidies. Canada is hook, line, and sinker in with the United States on this. I'm not saying that's a good thing. It's just a reality if you look at what's occurring. And my view on this, I've done some work on analyzing the Volkswagen subsidy deal that many of you in the room will be familiar with, $13 billion potentially from Canada to establish a Volkswagen battery plant here. And, the reality is that the Investment Reduction Act in the United States and the challenges that came with that Canada protested all the way to Capitol Hill repeatedly. A lot of that has evaporated because provided that the United States beggar thy neighbor policies don't actually affect this neighbor, we've decided we're okay with it. And in April, Deputy Prime Minister Freeland was in DC, and this is something she said in a speech. The IRA is an historic and transformative piece of legislation, one that will change the world for the better, is good for the United States, it is good for Canada, it is good for the world. From a Canadian Deputy Prime Minister. So, bottom line, when it comes to industrial subsidies, I don't think you're going to see Canada being particularly helpful unless it's to be aligned with the United States. On things like the advancement of ESG standards in trade, environmental standards, Canada's pretty happy to pursue more of a plurilateral approach, coalition of the willing. We're supporting Chancellor Schulz's ideas around climate clubs, which are really anyone who wants to come can come, and then you all have to live up to those standards. And I think that we are not going to stand in the way of the EU and its plans for a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And I've written some work around that. I don't think that Canada will develop its own unless we do so with the United States. At least I hope we don't. But I think that we will find a way to work together with the EU to help them if that's something they want to do. And then in broad WTO action that we've undertaken real advocacy around is the fish subsidies agreement. This reflects Canada's interests. We're a major fishing power. We need everyone to play by a set of rules in the ocean because it's a shared common good. And so we've had no choice but to engage broadly at the WTO level, multilaterally. So I think that you'll increasingly see us engaged in these kind of mix and match efforts in a way to continually try to advance our interests. And I'm not sure we're going to be particularly dogmatic about any one approach.
Great. Thank you very much. Mona, what are your thoughts on the way forward with regards to security arrangements, which you had mentioned are becoming more and more frequent in WTO dispute settlement?
Okay, so I'm going to embrace my 2 previous speakers and just tell it like it is, because I had to do the intro background stuff, which wasn't fun for any of you. And now I get to say more of what I actually think. So why is it different today? What makes it so different? There's no single reason, right? Technology has rapidly changed, but also the way that governments think about both the economy and defense have changed. What started, and this is what I mentioned to Wolfgang earlier, and sort of thinking about war in the sense of trench warfare to proxy wars, now is about security of supply, about this ability to control where getting supply from. And this is the way that a lot of serious sort of silent work or silent tensions that we wouldn't classify in the same way that wars are occurring all around the world, even as we speak, are thought of. And in particular with major economies. And so we're just beginning to unpack what economic security means. But the way that governments are thinking about this is dramatic, and it changes the way they think about how they intervene in these markets, the way things are produced, the way things are sold, the way consumers even think about things. Consumers need to know, for example, as Ricardo mentioned, that a good is made in China, not in Hong Kong, comma China, or Hong Kong / China. There's a particularity there to where the governments are thinking about this. And of course, the foundations of that don't align with that whatsoever. And so the exception, the way we thought about this, is completely stretched. But as someone who looks at the history and is beginning to even think further about how economic security played out, not just in the negotiations from the League of Nations to the GATT to the 90s and the WTO, is to ask, well, did they not know about this? Of course they did. So I don't have time to tell you the story, but I'm happy to during the reception, about the fact that an Australian economist, Herbert Coombs, thought about this question and talked to having a proposal where initially changes and tweaks to what we know today as Article 20G with the conservation of resources and Article 11 on the prohibition on quantitative restrictions was going to be altered to begin to think about planning for security concerns. Now, at the time, they were very worried about iron ore exports in Japan and the reflections from the war. And you see the Australians raising questions. How do we know if something is for civilian or military goods? Very similar questions that we think about today. And the response from the US negotiator was, we don't need to do all these changes. We don't need to think about this because we've already got a provision that covers that. And that's the provision that no WTO panel has talked about, Article 21B2, the supply of other goods of military establishment. The US negotiator said, look, we've got it. We can add directly or indirectly to Article 11. We've got this. We know that this can be addressed. Don't worry. And by the way, we know that it can have redress to the nullification or impairment provisions. Those are still there. The system still works as is. The Australians didn't buy that. They had a reservation. They tried to convince the other negotiators. Remember, it was a small group. It's not, the 164 consensus that we know today. To get in line with these changes, it wasn't done. So what does that mean? What does that matter? It means that at the time, even in 1947, there was a concern. What do we do about long-term planning of particular critical minerals, which I know Canada is concerned about? What do we do about this kind of planning? What do we do with potential threats, or if we're worried about exports and supply and security supply? So where does that leave us? Everyone makes fun of Sweden and the footwear, okay? But if we were dealing with trench warfare and there was an argument that every single soldier had to wear shoes because otherwise they were going to get cold feet, they would get pneumonia, they needed to have shoes, no one maybe would have questioned it. It's all about context. So how do we think about this today? We need to think more clearly about what economic security means. We need to ask ourselves, is it about rearming, giving weapons to a country that has been invaded? Is it about reconnecting or rewiring an energy grid because we need to deal with climate action? Is it about friendshoring, a favorite of the Deputy Prime Minister at that exact speech? Do we have to think about stocking and making sure we have security of supply? All of these may require very different responses. Not all of them will require rebalancing. And I say that to Simon Lester, who's not looking at me at all. Will you always need to have to compensate? Why? Why would you need to necessarily for this? Well, because we don't know how long it'll go. We don't know who will be impacted. All of these require very detailed discussions, require rules and navigation to do it. I'm gonna stop there.
Thank you. Henry, back to you. You had mentioned earlier the China challenge, as you called it. And in your recent book, you argue that WTO members never make full use of the rules in China's accession protocol to challenge Chinese practices at the WTO. Based on that analysis, what prospects do you see for using WTO dispute settlement to resolve geo-economic tensions?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, the conventional wisdom is that there are two alleged culprits to the ineffectiveness of the WTO rules against China. One is the Appellate Body because of its jurisprudence on public body, and the other is the Chinese government with its state capitalist policies. But in our new book, we actually argue that the solutions are actually ironically provided by these two very culprits. First of all, the Appellate Body has actually been recalibrating its public body jurisprudence. So if you look at some of the later Appellate Body jurisprudences, such as this case of US countervailing measures, China Article 25, in 2019, China actually tried to push the boundaries of the authority-based approach by arguing that the control by the government need to be proven in each transaction. But the Appellate Body actually disagreed by opting for an entity-based approach. So once an entity is found to be a public body, then all of its conduct are directly attributable to the government of the member concerned. So that actually helped a lot with the evidentiary burden for countries challenging China's subsidies. Second, in recent years, China itself has been pushing for a party building initiative in all firms, that is not just SOEs, but even private firms and foreign invested firms. And in all these firms, they will need to establish party cells, and the party cells are not just for show. Instead, the firms will need to amend their articles of association to state that the party committees must be consulted on all major decisions and that they would have a veto power. So if you want evidence of control by the government or by the party, it is right there. So this, if used properly, could solve the alleged problems created by the public body jurisprudence. And actually, here I'm looking at Lothar, who works for the EU. The EU has been using exactly this to demonstrate the control by the party and the government. Actually, they have used this in an anti-dumping case. The anti-dumping case concerning a firm in Xiamen in 2021. And I think that is actually a very good way of using it, and I encourage other WTO members to follow suit. So more broadly, we remain optimistic in the ability of using WTO dispute settlement to resolve geo-economic tensions. One thing people often forget is that the WTO is the only binding dispute settlement system with the participation of both the US and China. But this is destroyed when the US sabotaged the Appellate Body. Therefore, we argue in the book that we need to have a more aggressive enforcement of existing rules through, for example, bringing what Professor Geneva Hillman calls for a big, bold WTO case against China, and also to fully utilize the potential of a WTO dispute settlement system, we need to resolve the Appellate Body paralysis. But this doesn't mean that we should follow the kitchen sink approach by pushing all kinds of politically sensitive cases to the dispute settlement system. As it is often said, hard cases make bad law. So the problem is not really with the Appellate Body making bad decisions. It is with the members pushing hard issues that they can't even resolve through negotiations to the dispute settlement system. So on the one hand, the WTO members need to restore the negotiating functions through various initiatives such as the GSIs to restore rules which are up to date. On the other hand, there needs to be a mechanism to screen out political sensitive cases rather than forcing the Appellate Body to answer these difficult questions. This could potentially be achieved, for example, through the introduction of a political question doctrine as found in US constitutional law. I guess I'm getting into a territory that is too technical, so I'll stop here and look forward to the discussion for the next 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Rob and Joanna, we come back to you and to the article that you wrote that really framed the discussion for us this afternoon. And I'm wondering if you could make some concluding remarks about diversity and pluralism in the WTO's underlying credo. You make the case that the WTO's perceived rules perceived inability to rein in state capitalism. And that's really a feature, not a bug. So if you could, both of you, please make any final comments with regards to diversity and pluralism. Thank you.
For sure.
Thanks. So what do we call, state capitalism? Is the United States CHIPS Act state capitalism? Is NASA in its relationship to Boeing state capitalism? Yes, and just because the US doesn't choose to do industrial policy through primarily through state-owned enterprises or sovereign wealth funds, it doesn't make the policies in question any less forms of government intervention or direction of the economy. So when we think about what the Biden administration is doing today, it seems to me almost absurd that they would still have on their agenda the idea of reining in, state capitalism, because they would be saying we need to rein in exactly the policies that we've worked so hard to get through Congress in the last number of years. And I just have and on just pluralism and diversity more generally, I think it's interesting if you read the voluminous literature now about the compatibility of the EU CBAM with WTO law. And these issues of carbon border adjustment under WTO rules, I remember writing about them with Antonia Aliasson 10 years ago or more, and people would say, why do you write these completely hypothetical issues that have no relationship to real trade disputes? And here we go. But what's interesting is that the appellate body jurisprudence in gasoline and shrimp is the departure point for almost every serious article or commentary on these issues. And that, to my mind, shows the power of the anchoring effect of the appellate body. And in my observation, again, I've not read all the articles, but I try to follow most of the articles of commentary. That hasn't changed with the end of the appellate body. That line drawing. And so it largely amounts to a question of what's even handed under the chapeau of Article 20. And so that really narrows the range of legal conflict and puts a lot of focus on the facts, the details of administration, and the kind of regulatory dialogue that may be possible between the EU and its trading partners to ensure that in actual practice, the CBAM is even handed. And unlike some of my colleagues in the US, like Tim Meyer and Todd Tucker, I actually think that the EU has done a very good job of not only making the basic design WTO compatible, but also arguing that it's WTO compatible. And the way it's able to do it is because there's a wide acceptance of these basic lines and equilibria that were defined by the appellate body in this case law. And I think that that can be preserved, at least for a period of time, without renewing the appellate body. But the bigger challenge, and this I think explains why the Biden administration or some of its leading policy figures are not that interested so much in the WTO. They're not interested in destroying it. They're not like the Trump people, but take the pandemic. What would have been the point of having a dispute about export and import restrictions, about PPE that would last 3 years? We would get a decision, a final decision of the system, and the pandemic would be over. Instead, of course, what we had was a useful dialogue so that countries would not just look at the problem as sauf qui peut, that there are constraints and rules, and that we have to confront each other, members have to confront each other about the extent to which, even in such an emergency, they're still respectful of the legitimate interests of others that might be protected under those rules. Final example, an executive of a Chinese company is indicted in the Eastern District of New York, allegedly for misrepresenting an affiliated company's connection to sanction trade with Iran. There's extradition. The executive is detained in Vancouver, and then China kidnaps and detains two Canadians. Now, it's a dispute ultimately about international economic law, right? Because the underlying legal framework is sanctions against Iran. But it's the kind of dispute that we have to be modest also that the WTO can't solve. It could provide very important guidelines on a crucial issue like the compatibility of border adjustment with liberalized trade, but it can't help in this problem. And it didn't help, and we couldn't have expected it to help. So as I said to somebody who was an interested party in trying to solve this problem, go back to the Eastern District. The solution doesn't lie with Ottawa. It doesn't lie with Beijing. It probably lies with the Eastern District. And like slightly making a misrepresentation in a PowerPoint presentation is not really such a serious offense. Maybe it can be solved in a way that satisfies the concerns of the Eastern District, and that ultimately leads to a resolution that gets everybody out of detention. And ultimately, something like that happens. So I only use this anecdote to say that one has to be very creative and modest, because sometimes, legal solutions through international adjudication are not the answer. In other cases, they're indispensable to guidelines for the making of policy in new areas. So we just have to bear in mind what can and cannot be done through international adjudication.
Thank you. Okay, I'll just add a small rejoinder to what Rob has to say, because of course I think from the perspective we've developed and from our own perspectives that a lot can be done through, deliberation, committees, other mechanisms, right? I think that moving to other approaches could solve a lot of the problems that WTO members face. But I think it is important before we give up on two-level dispute settlement to think about why we do think it's important and still worth fighting for. And I think, this is perhaps naive to say, but I think having a reason-giving body that can develop the WTO's legal order in a coherent way and that can actively preserve diversity and pluralism for states, not merely a means of ending disputes between states, but actually telling us how to interpret this complex body of law, I think that's extremely important. So any form of dispute settlement that didn't issue reasons or was only kind of politically based, I think I would sort of caution against. I also think, pluralism for our perspective isn't kind of each state doing as it wishes. It's rather a kind of a carefully calibrated balance between responding to the spillover effects of economic harms and respecting the domain reservé of each state. So maintaining this balance does, in certain circumstances, require a deft judicial actor who's independent and impartial from the membership. So I guess I still hold out hope for an ideal return to the appellate body. But if that's not possible, I also want to leave us on a note of hope, which is that I think that as we have written, there's reason to think that the appellate body's jurisprudence will live on, as Rob has alluded to. And I think we've seen that in the jurisprudence that's emerged thus far, as limited as it is. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
And just to clarify, I totally agree,
Okay,
Joe,
no,
about, I just think that it may be unrealistic, but also unnecessary to get the US to accept the compulsory jurisdiction, just as they don't accept compulsory jurisdiction, to my knowledge, of virtually any other court or international court.
Okay, fantastic. Please join me in thanking the panelists, first of all. This was a wonderful discussion with a lot of great ideas. So we'd like to open the floor up. Please come up, make comments, ask questions. I suggest that we take 3 at a time. And we have some questions coming in online as well too. I can't see them from where I'm sitting, but please take the opportunity to come up and just, yes, if you'd like to come here, just to the microphone, that would be great, just to ensure people online can hear you. Thank you very much. And if you could introduce yourself too, just for the benefit of others in the room.
Hello, I'm Lothar Ehring. I work for the European Commission. I have a quick question for Professor Gao and one first for Professor Paulsen. Isn't it particularly untimely to have various interpretations of the emergency concept in the security exception? And if they are not consistent with another, that means either all of them are incorrect or all but one of them are incorrect. There's no other possibility. Isn't that untimely? Because when you say it is justiciable, then it's also important that it be correct. And did I understand you correctly as actually commenting on this? Because you said that the latest panel has narrowed the emergency concept. And if you use narrow as a transitive verb, that means the panel changed it from what it correctly is, and then that one is incorrect, which you may have read. It's also what several WTO members said in the DSB meeting in late January. And to Henry, my question is, granted what you said on a public body, I won't add anything to that now. But speaking of SOEs, state-owned enterprises, and subsidies more generally, how many of the perceived so-called China problems do you think could be solved likewise through a good approach and interpretation and application of the GATT rule on state-owned enterprises and their the ban on them to discriminate? And secondly, the actionable subsidy rules, because the CVD that you went into is never a global solution, because the home market is not foreign markets and the country of origin. So the actionable subsidies is the only possible real and full solution. And those subsidies, if they're a problem, then because they do distort trade. And if they distort trade, then it should be possible to demonstrate this, perhaps with a little bit less difficulty than the practice in the subsidy cases has shown or suggested. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I saw another hand up, but yes, please come and ask. We'll take three. But if anybody else has a question now, please come up.
Hi, Tommaso Soave, Central European University. I have a question about, well, the Washington offensive on the appellate body. We heard from Professors House and Langille about the jurisprudential disagreement, true or false, accurate or inaccurate. We heard from Professors Gauss and Paulsen about the geostrategic, geoeconomic dimension of the US malaise. I was wondering if we could add a third layer, maybe not the most important, but still present, that is the US discontent with the institutional and professional culture of WTO dispute settlement itself. I think that under some of the declarations and the moves made by the United States that led to the downfall of the appellate body, there was a certain discontent with, for example, the role of the Secretariat and its interplay with the adjudicators, the creation of a very close-knit community of litigators coming from always the same law firms and government departments litigating cases, the scholarly consensus that we had a World Trade Court and not an appellate body, and so on and so forth. So I would be curious if any of the speakers would like to pick up on this third dimension, if you see it as having played a role or if it's just very, very marginal compared to the others. Thank you.
Well, I think that the criticism of judicial activism, as my co-author articulated, it really goes to this dimension of attacking the appellate body as a court, and so it begs, in a way, it begs the question of what the appellate body would be expected to be if not a court. And this goes back to the negotiating history, where there was an idea by some of the negotiators that the appellate body would only be a solution in instances where much of the membership felt that a panel decision was badly erroneous. In other words, it was so bad that it posed a systemic threat to the legitimacy of dispute settlement. And the GATT insiders had 2 or 3 examples of such cases that were viewed as outliers. And the idea here was that the appellate body would correct, panels that went on these follies of their own in very rare cases rather than routine appeal. But as you know, when there's a right to appeal and your domestic stakeholders effectively are impacted by losing a case or not winning it, what do you tell the stakeholders? Oh, the appeal mechanism is only for very rare cases that we think are, so aberrative that they have to be corrected by somebody. And we're not going to bother appealing where we might win ultimately for your interest. You can't do that. And so it was predictable that contrary to this insider view of rare appeals, that there would be routine appeals. And in fact, in almost an overwhelming majority of cases, at least at the outset. So, but I think there's the deeper question of whether the United States is the Washington culture around international relations had ever accepted the idea of really compulsory jurisdiction. And I'm old enough to remember the Dole Amendment. What was the Dole Amendment? When there was the question of whether the US would agree to the new binding compulsory dispute settlement system, it might not have gotten through Congress, but for this amendment. And what did the amendment say? That a panel of US judges, if I recall correctly, and there are some in the room who have institutional memories perhaps as long as mine, a panel of US judges would assess the results of the dispute settlement system. And if in enough disputes where the United States lost, this panel of US judges took the view that the US was wrongly treated in the dispute settlement, there could be a resolution before Congress to withdraw the United States from the WTO. So ultimately, the system only got through Congress through this kind of fig leaf or artifice that at the end of the day, US judges would be the ultimate check on whether the dispute settlement system was going to be working against US sovereignty. So that should have been a warning signal that there was really something tenuous and unusual about the US accepting the compulsory jurisdiction on which the system was based. And again, in no other instance does the US really accept full compulsory jurisdiction of international courts. So in a way, and to summarize very briefly, American exceptionalism is the rule, and this was a qualified exception to American exceptionalism. And so I think if we put it in that historical or broader perspective of the US view of international adjudication in general, it seems somehow less shocking or less of a fundamentally disruptive event.
Great, thank you. So Ricardo's going to make a point, and Henry, and you'll speak to.
Yeah, just very briefly on compulsory jurisdiction. Let's play this out. Let's give US a chance to have compulsory jurisdiction and refuse to adjudicate a dispute. What would happen? Would the US accept any trade remedy case that comes to WTO jurisdiction on any trade remedy case? First question. The second question is, wouldn't it give the US an excuse to, and I insist on this power play? Well, disputes where the US is as claimant will force countries to have to accept jurisdiction of that tribunal. And when the US is defendant, would the US play the power play again and say, well, will not accept. I will not accept compulsory jurisdiction. So at the end, I'm not sure that if we play or if we were to agree on a compulsory jurisdiction scheme, wouldn't that the U.S. is precisely what the U.S. wanted.
Yeah, so Lota's question regarding Chinese SOEs, whether they could be challenged as actionable or prohibited subsidies. Well, I agree with you. According to the general rules of the WTO, there are, in addition to export subsidies, there's three types of prohibited subsidies. Three types of actionable subsidies, like region specific, industry specific, firm specific. But actually, interestingly, in China's accession package, they do have a special rule for Chinese SOEs. So if you have a subsidy and the subsidies are predominantly given to SOEs, then they will be considered to be also specific subsidies, and therefore also actionable. So that is something I don't think has been used extensively, and I hope it could be used extensively, because I mean, I just don't understand the logic of the Western countries when on the one hand they keep complaining that China has a state capitalism is a big problem, but on the other hand, if you look at all these trade remedies cases they have against China, more anti-dumping cases are brought against Chinese firms than countervailing duty cases. I mean, if you look at the anti-dumping cases, they target mostly private firms, right? By countervailing duty cases, by definition, would target mostly, SOEs. So if you are really worried about state capitalism, you should see more countervailing duties brought against Chinese firms. But they haven't done that, I mean, of course, I mean, if you talk to trade lawyers, they will give you the Euro explanation of the difficulty of collecting evidence and so on. But as I have argued in the new book, all these problems have not been solved because President Xi basically give you the answer, right in a plate, because he has all these new rules requiring party presence, and not just a presence, but also party control in every firm in China. And that is a hard evidence right there. And it's only up to every WTO member to make use of that. So I would really hope to see more countervailing duty cases brought. And also at a broader level, in addition to challenging the unilaterally through countervailing duties, you can also challenge it through WTO litigation. Again, here, I think, there need to be a coordinated position taken on these issues. Here, I would, I would suggest that the countries could borrow from the tactic used by the US civil rights lawyers, during the civil rights movement, when they started bringing all these test cases, right, carefully selected cases that was establish good precedents that they could use in later cases. Of course, I mean, every case is specific to that specific case, but if you establish a good precedent, this could be used in the future. But again, with the appellate body being destroyed by the US, it's not going to work because China can always appeal into the void. So the number one priority has to bring back the appellate body.
So Lothar, to your question, why did I choose the word narrow, and did I see it as narrowing? So a couple of things. First, of the 4 cases we have that have been brought through the WTO system, right? Esteemed panelists selectively chosen, I'm sure on purpose with the nature of the cases, but circumstances where you had very clear evidence of what was going on. Russia and Ukraine, for the annexation of Crimea, a clear act, deterioration of relations. Saudi Arabia and Qatar, another clear example. It's difficult to then understand how the interpretation of this subparagraph, this basket, as I said in the beginning, translates into something like the US, where it's talking about its relationship with China. And in those particular cases that have come up with the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs, and then with the origin marking labeling requirements, the assessment of how to understand the relationship between those disputing parties and to recognize that it was always about the relationship between the United States and China made it a very difficult task to assess. And both of those panels that dealt with the 232 and the origin marking don't explicitly just adhere or follow to the previous two reports. They go through the motions of assessing the security exception, particularly for DS597, the origin marking label, in a far more rigorous way than even I think the original Russia-Ukraine dispute panel did. And so therefore it was very difficult to convey what to do in a more economic security kind of frame of mind when dealing with that. And the way that they did it, recognizing that the United States was beginning to reconceptualize its measures in a security way, and some of that is nothing to do with the multilateral trading system. It is about the fact that domestically they are seeing their economic policy in a far more security way, and that's a discussion for a different topic. The way that they did it, and this is why, Hélène, I was saying it, I wrote the "if I were an appellate body" post, which I think maybe the US, I would like to think, read before they spoke at that DSB meeting at the end of January, because their concern was the fact that the way the panels explained emergency international relations was severe breakdown, total breakdown. And in particular, any evidence of international cooperation between the disputing parties automatically meant the security exceptions shouldn't be invoked. Why? Because security is invoked at the WTO when there's no other alternative. When it's absolutely clear the relations will not continue, that's when you bring up security. And that's absolutely not the way the United States understood security, nor do I think necessarily the Commission in understanding its new policies towards de-risking. Governments are thinking about, well, we don't know what de-risk. I don't want to be on the side of risking to critique de-risking now. So I think we need to think more clearly about that. And that was one of the concerns, was that, and this was a, you know, if the guidance from these panels is to tell governments, if you want to invoke security, you need to demonstrate this absolute decoupling. And if you're dealing with these relations, that invites governments to say, okay, if I want to have it be justified, I need to make sure that I'm making very clear that I am having that severe breakdown. Now, what I hope I left you with, though, today is to say, the more big danger, the bigger pink elephant in the room is B2, military establishment. Why? Because no one knows what military establishment means anymore in 2023. And it's vague enough to allow governments to do a lot, necessarily even in time of something. So we know that there was a strict limiting on B3 for emergency international relations. We don't know if that'll encourage governments to take more severe measures, which is why I said narrowing. It seemed to be narrow, but it was narrow because the circumstances were quite different than the Russia-Ukraine context, right? So I'll stop there.
Did Joanna, would you like to say anything? You're good? Okay, so sorry. So I think we're going to move now from navigating stormy waters to having a wonderful reception sponsored by Bennett Jones. And so thank you very much for coming. I think the conference is off to a wonderful start, and I look forward to chatting with you around the room. Thank you very much.